Writers and readers experience time differently, so let's synchronize those clocks. Every so often, I'll spend a few hours writing something, only to read back through it and discover that I've used the same word or phrase multiple times in sequential paragraphs. It's an experience that reminds me that reading and writing are very different experiences temporally. I think without exception, we all write more slowly than we read, so at my writing pace, I'm only using thus every 15 minutes or so, which feels pretty natural and doesn't really call attention to itself. But then when I read it back, thus is suddenly popping up every 45 seconds, so what felt when I was writing like reasonable sentence variety becomes when I'm reading insufferable sentence monotony. And the more I've read the work of less experienced writers, the more I've come to recognize a strain of issues in writing that all seem to arise from a basic misunderstanding of how reading and writing differ in a temporal sense. As with all things writing related, the biggest growth will occur when we learn to see our writing through the eyes of a reader. So obviously we want to present arguments that are tailored to a specific audience, but we also want to be mindful of other elements of the reading experience, and time is one of those aspects. So I thought we'd take some time to talk about the temporal differences in the experiences of reading and writing in order to work through those issues and make sure that we're creating the most effective experiences for our readers. So let's not waste any more time and get right into it. Perhaps the most obvious way that time shows up in writing is in sequence, when we're thinking about the order of events that readers experience as they read. And in a lot of ways, sequence might be where readers and writers have the most shared experience, but not always. For example, it's a common piece of advice to tell writers to write their introductions last because they don't know what their paper's about yet. Writing an introduction first is to pretend that you know what you have to say before you have even thought about it. But readers will always encounter the introduction first, which marks a clear difference between the way that readers and writers will experience the same piece. And the reality is that you don't need to present things to your reader in the same order that you wrote them. In fact, you often shouldn't. So you'll write things in whatever order you think of them, and that's totally fine. But when you're revising and organizing your piece for an audience, you'll want to think about the steps your readers need to take along the way. If you're trying to persuade readers to take action in order to solve some kind of problem, for example, you'll probably want to spend some time persuading them that the problem is, in fact, a problem before telling them what to do about it. If they don't see the problem, it's really unlikely that they'll do anything to fix it. With narrative fiction, where plots are often driven by cause and effect sequences of events, the order of scenes that you present to a reader is obviously important. And with poetry, the first and last images of a piece will often make or break the reader's experience. In fact, advice about the importance of sequence can be found at least as far back as the Rhetorica ad Herennium, which was a guide for writing legal arguments in ancient Rome. The author of that text explains the 6 stages of legal argumentation: an introduction, a description of the facts of the case, a discussion of where the two parties agree and disagree, a presentation of the arguments for one's own side, a refutation of arguments for the other side, and a conclusion. But beyond providing a generalized outline for legal arguments, the author also discusses some other strategic sequential considerations. They write, 1. The strongest arguments should be placed at the beginning and at the end of the pleading, and 2. Those of medium force, which are weak if presented separately, but become strong and plausible when conjoined with the others, should be placed in the middle. So we can see that sequence can have a significant effect on how readers experience our work. It's the same principle that my high school orchestra conductor used for concerts. We played our best piece first to make a good first impression, and we played our second best piece to leave a lasting impression of a polished and satisfying performance. Everything else got buried in the middle. It's a principle that has nothing to do with when you thought of things, but instead, it's about presenting a sequence that best serves your readers. One of the most common experiences I have while grading papers is reading a paragraph or sentence that says something like, "Many experts agree that doing bad things is bad." And at that point, I'll usually comment something like, "That's great, but if you're going to mention these experts, you should probably cite them so that people don't think you're making them up." And then a few paragraphs or even sentences later, I'll run into some quotes and citations, the same ones that I was impatient to get a little bit earlier. And this is a classic case of the mismatch between the temporality of reading and of writing. The information that I was looking for as a reader is there in the paper, It just doesn't show up at the right time. Writing time is much less linear than reading time. When you're writing, you might spend a few hours writing some paragraphs, take a break to do some chores or watch TV, and then come back maybe to fix up a paragraph that you wrote the other day, or skip ahead to find some sources that you'll use at the end of your paper. You can see your project from the vantage point of a master plan. You know what you're trying to accomplish, and you know what every piece is doing along the way. When you say that experts agree, you know that you'll get to them in your own good mystical time. But your reader doesn't. The only things they know are what they've already read. They're stuck in the linear time of reading a piece from beginning to end. So they don't know that the evidence for your claim is coming. They only know that they don't have it now. And unfortunately, now is when they need it. So it's not good enough just to have all the information in your paper. You also want to make sure that it's in the right place so that readers will encounter it at the right time. And there's more than one way to handle a situation like this. The easiest and most effective is probably just to include the evidence when you make the claim. That way your readers can see where your knowledge comes from immediately, and they won't have time to worry about whether you're trying to trick them or not. Another totally viable option is to just tell your readers that that information is coming later. Maybe getting into those sources right now would just open up a larger, more complex discussion that you just don't want to deal with yet. And that's fine. In that case, just say, as we'll see later, many experts agree that doing bad things is bad. That way, your readers will know that more information is coming, and they won't have to worry that they're being shortchanged in the moment. Of course, issues of timing can show up in other ways too. We've talked before about upside-down papers, which wait until the very end of the paper to present the actual argument. In those cases, the writer knows that the point of the whole paper is coming, but the reader doesn't, and so they're likely to give up on it before they ever get to the point. It's a problem that could be fixed by adjusting the timing of the main argument of the paper and telling readers up front what they're getting themselves into. That's why so many people tell writers to put their thesis in the first paragraph of the paper. When you get the timing right by making it early, readers will have a much better sense of humor about all the rest of the stuff that they have to read. And a similar thing happens in other kinds of writing too. I regularly run into short stories that are obviously hiding some kind of plot point for some reason until later. Sure, a mystery and a dramatic reveal can be exciting, but most mysteries are overrated, cheap tricks that undermine the integrity of a story. There's a difference between engaging readers in a compelling mystery where they discover things alongside the characters and an irritating secret where the narrator and characters all seem to know what's going on, but the reader is left arbitrarily in the dark. That's a problem of manners, but it's also a problem of timing. The writer has kept something secret in order to build towards some imagined dramatic reveal, when the reality is that that information would be useful up front to help the reader understand and appreciate what's at stake in the story. So, as with all of the points that we're talking about today, put yourself in your reader's shoes and imagine when you would want to know the things that you're presenting. Just having the information there isn't good enough. It also needs to show up at the right time. And, of course, I can't give you a universal rule of thumb for getting the timing right. It will always depend on what you're writing and what you're trying to accomplish. But you'll be way ahead of most people if you're even thinking about it, and if you don't get it right the first time, that's what revision is for. We tend to associate importance with quantity. Monarchs live in massive castles on enormous plots of land, while regular people live in small apartments. The best athletes get gold medals that are worth more than bronze ones, and we're more likely to spend a lot of time with the people and things that matter the most to us than with the ones that don't. And the same is true, or at least that same perception is in effect, when we're writing. If we're not careful, we can mislead our readers into thinking that something is important when we spend too much time talking about it. For example, I've read a lot of short fiction that spends pages and pages describing the protagonist and their daily habits, and the setting and geopolitics and the weather, and then only leaves a paragraph or two for the actual plot of the story. And I'm probably not presenting world-shattering news when I say that the plot is the point of the story and what it should be spending most of its time on. Maybe you've heard people complain about info dumps or lengthy expositions, and part of the issue is that they can be boring, but the underlying problem is that they're a case of writers spending too much time where readers don't need to spend much at all. Do you need to figure out all the relationships between your characters and their world before you start writing the story? Well, yeah, probably. But does your reader need to spend time learning all those things before they can settle into the story? No. The reader is here for the plot, so get to it. Those other details can unfold as the plot progresses. But don't forget that readers of fiction come to fiction for stories, not for history lessons. If you spend time on something, a reader will think that it's important, and the more time you spend on it, the more important it will feel. When your piece asks readers to spend a whole chunk of their life on something, and then it turns out not to be that important, they'll probably be pretty annoyed. And it's not just stories. Academic arguments can do the same thing. I mentioned earlier that it makes sense to persuade your audience that there is a problem before proposing a solution, but I've also read a lot of papers that spend about 70% of their length explaining why the problem is a problem, and then only leaving themselves about 30% to do the rest of the persuasive job. But the point of an argument is not just to describe a problem. That's an important step, but it's not the most important step, so it shouldn't be getting the most amount of time. Again, readers will begin to think that whatever's getting the most time is the most important thing. When it turns out not to be, they'll feel like their time was wasted and like you didn't spend enough time talking about what really mattered. So be mindful of how much time you spend on various aspects of your writing because it tells your readers what they should be paying attention to. If there's a mismatch between what you want your readers to think is most important and what they actually spend the most time on, you're going to run into some trouble. Time is a funny thing. As the scientists tell us, it's relative, and while that might be true when you're traveling near the speed of light, it's also true when you're writing. Writing time is slow, non-linear, and flexible in a way that reading time usually isn't. If you're stuck in writing time, you'll end up causing problems for your readers who can't help but see your work differently from you. If, however, you can step outside of writing time and see your work from the perspective of reading time, you'll be able to find and fix potential reading problems before they ever have a chance to cause any trouble. So become a time traveler, or better yet, something like a time amphibian, working as comfortably in reading time as writing time, and you'll be able to create worthwhile experiences for your readers. And I suppose at this point we'll part ways for now. Thanks as always for watching, and have a great time thinking about time until we meet again next time.